Imagine you need to give your friend directions to your house.
But your friend is in a nightclub.
It's loud and it's dark.
You can't see or hear them well.
On top of that, you can't use language to speak to them anyway.
This is, in gross human terms, similar to what honeybees experience in their colonies when they try to tell their sisters where to find the best nectar and pollen. Their solution? Interpretive dance.
But how can their tiny nervous systems get complex information like direction and distance from their dancing sisters when they can't see?
This question has puzzled scientists throughout the 20th century. Now, with the help of computers, scientists can decode the waggle dance like never before.
I'm Barbara Webb from the University of Edinburgh. I run the Insect Robotics lab. We do research on insects and we implement that work on robots. The bee dance is a good example. As you said, people have looked at it for years and years. And if you'd asked people and they said, do we know how the followers get it? They'd say, oh, yeah, we know. They use their antennae. But they don't know. They didn't know. And if you'd asked them to build, an algorithmic or physical model of it, they wouldn't have been able to show you how to make it all work.
So that dancer, can you share for the listeners, and maybe it'll cut back and forth with Barbara and Anna, what about the dance am I looking for?
So honeybees, when they're dancing, they're going to be dancing for a certain amount of time, and that correlates to distance, so how long they're walking and waggling. And then the angle at which they do their dance relative, I'm not sure if it's to the colony or to gravity, it might actually be gravity, tells their sisters what angle from the sun to go. So they get distance and angle.
I'm Anna Hadjitofi, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh within the School of Informatics. As part of my PhD, I'm really interested in studying the underlying neural mechanisms of the honeybee waggle dance. The waggle dance is a form of communication that honeybees do, and it's to share the location of resources with nestmates inside the hive. So this can be the location of food, but also sites that they're going to swarm to as well, which is where like half the colony will leave and relocate somewhere else. And what happens is a kind of forager, in the case of sharing a food location, a forager will leave the hive. When she gets to a certain age, she'll start going out and foraging. She'll find food, which in their case is nectar and pollen, and then she'll come back to the hive. And we kind of call it a waggle dance because when she comes onto the comb, and in the species we've studied, it's a kind of vertical comb in a cavity, so it's enclosed and dark. And she will start kind of rapidly shaking her abdomen along the comb. And she does this really quickly. And the kind of key features of this behavior is that the direction that she waggles on the vertical comb correlates with the direction that the food is relative to the sun upon leaving the hive. So although she signals the direction relative to gravity, when they fly, they actually transform this relative to the sun. And the duration of the waggle phase on the comb correlates with the distance to the food. So there's like this kind of mapping that other nestmates will gather around her and assimilate the information from.
So in the interview today, we're going to learn about an insight that they discovered through their research relating to the antennae specifically and how this information gets communicated.
It's my understanding that researchers identified the waggle dance pretty early, like back to von Frisch, and I want to say that's like the 1800s, maybe early 1900s, but they didn't necessarily know what it was for. And it wasn't really until the 90s that anyone had figured out, yes, it's communicating distance, angle, that kind of thing. The technology really had to catch up.
And also, as good science is, they make predictions. As I learned in Thomas Seeley's book, Honeybee Democracy, there was an occasion and a great story in that book where he's on this remote island where there's just one grumpy fisherman. And at some point in observing the dance, he's like, these bees aren't going where I think they're going. Why are they signaling the wrong direction from the ideal hive I put out for them? And before it actually happens, he's able to predict, oh, they're headed for the fisherman's house. Lo and behold, they were going down his chimney. He comes running out the house because his house is suddenly filled with honeybees.
Oh, no. Any idea? What did he figure out why they wanted to go? Were they swarming and wanted to build a nest in his chimney?
They were swarming and looking for a new home, and apparently Thomas had created some very, luxury condominiums for them, but the market shifted, and they just were more interested in that chimney at the time, I guess.
This is my experience with bumblebees or any kind of bees. They can be a little inscrutable and not do what you want.
Well, always noise in the data, I guess, yeah.
But it's amazing how predictive it is that he was able, as a human, to look at the dance and go, I'm going to go figure out exactly where they're going.
Yeah, I mean, if the decision is where's the new hive, for example, in a swarming event, actually Thomas Seeley in the book breaks down a number of interesting factors that they look at. Volume is important, finding an ideal, it's usually an empty, hollowed out tree trunk that they're going to move into. Although, of course, you can create artificial environments like that to try and lure them to the desired place. He found that the hole size, about, I want to say 4 inches or so, there was an ideal hole size he identified, and the hole position was best found near the bottom of the hollowed out volume. So there are a handful of parameters that are known that can really zone in on what the utility function is the bees are looking at. How do they evaluate the quality of a nest?
And sometimes they still end up on your car for some reason when they swarm. But I imagine most times they don't. They end up in appropriate places.
Well, while we're at it, what can you tell us about tarantula communication, if there is such a thing?
There is. Tarantula communication is usually going to happen during fights or during mating. During mating, the males will come up to the female's burrow or wherever she's hiding, and they start doing a little tap dance with their front feet. And if she taps back, that's a very good sign. So they're doing a lot of vibrational communication, and that's their main deal. But they're probably doing a lot of chemoreception that they're not aware of, so smell, even though they don't have a nose like what we would think of as a nose. And some of them stridulate, so some of them make squeaky sounds. But I think that's more for predators and surprising the predator that's trying to eat them than it is communicating with each other. And then they also have things like threat poses, and no one has ever tested this, but if you look at the bottom of their front feet, they're very shiny and reflect light. And we know they can also see polarized light. So I kind of wonder if their feet, when light reflects off of the bottoms, if they're kind of like signals at the airport when you're directing air traffic. But no one's ever tested that. And the fact that they're shiny could just be a byproduct of just the structure of the hairs on their feet. So no one's looked at that. That's just me speculating.
Well, could be. Yeah, you're right. But fascinating hypothesis. So, Becky, maybe to wind up, we should talk a little bit about how science like this takes place. Obviously, Anna knew Barbara a little bit through this study and then came back as a grad student or as a postdoc. For listeners maybe early on in those processes, not even knowing what a postdoc is, how does science like this come together? How do people connect and figure out how to work on things together?
So it's different for different countries. So what I'm going to describe is going to be typical of the United States and also a little bit similar to, say, UK, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. In the case of Barbara and Anna, and you'll hear them discuss this, Anna got an internship in Barbara's lab, and that relationship developed, and she got to do her research for graduate school with Barbara. For me, I contacted my advisor out of the blue, and she had never met me before, and we met and talked and had to decide if we were a good fit. It's sort of the most intimidating speed date you can do. Like, can I commit to 4 to 6 years with this person, and are we going to work together on the basis of a couple interviews? And then you get to working with them. And one thing I've noticed with my master's degree and my PhD program, and maybe you'll hear it a little bit with our guests, is as a student, you get so in the weeds, just going through your data and going through the drudgery, that sometimes the big discoveries and the aha moments almost pass you up a little bit because you're so worried with everything else. And it's really nice to have an advisor and a mentor at that point that can say, look what you did. Look how cool this is. So it's a really interesting process to get a major advisor and go through a whole PhD dissertation and discover something new with this other person that that you've committed to, even though you may only have had a summer working with them or a short conversation.
Seems like certainly more to learn about bees and other insects where communication is taking place that we can't always observe. Can you share some details about, without maybe spoiling the punchline, what our 2 interview guests were looking into today?
There were lots of hypotheses about exactly what observer bees are attenuating to and how they're attenuating to it when they're observing a dancer. Being inside a colony, it's really noisy, it's really dark. When we watch videos of the waggle dance, we can see all the angles, we can see the distance that the bee is walking, but their sisters can't see any of that. So it has to either be through feel, through chemicals, or through electromagnetism. There's a few different options because there's some things bees can sense that we can't see. So specifically, the researchers in this case were looking at antennae. So you have the antennae sticking out from the head, they can touch the dancing bee, and the antennae can move whenever the dancing bee moves. So that is what they started looking into.
Well, the one constant in my own career is lifelong learning. I've never been able to rest on my laurels. So if you're looking to pivot or to grow and become a data-savvy leader, consider the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. They offer a 100% online business analytics graduate certificate program. It teaches professionals how to analyze and interpret data. The online program's got 4 courses: business analytics for managers, machine learning for business data prep and visualization, and analysis of unstructured data. That is a great coverage of topics to prep you to be a professional in any industry. This program definitely allows a work-life balance, so if you've got a lot going on, it'll fit in. If you want to push hard, you can take 2 courses a semester and graduate within a year. The Business Analytics Graduate Certificate can be your gateway to a Georgia Tech MBA. You can apply select credits towards the Georgia Tech full-time MBA, evening MBA, or online MS in Analytics. So are you ready to become a data-savvy leader? Applications are open for fall 2024. Visit techgradcertificates.com to learn more and apply before their May 1st deadline. That's techgradcertificates.com.
I'm Barbara Webb from the University of Edinburgh.
I'm Anna Hadjitofi, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh.
How did you both meet each other?
I think we both met each other when I was finishing my undergrad in neuroscience. I reached out to Barbara for a summer internship, and I think that was the first time we met. So I came to Edinburgh, and then I went away, did a master's, and worked in industry for a couple of years. And had always known that I wanted to do a PhD, and then that's when I reached back out to Barbara, and then that's where the story continued.
And Barbara, where does your interest in the waggle dance begin?
I've been interested in bee navigation behavior for a long time, and you can't not be aware of the bee dance. I mean, if you work in insects at all, you're bound to find out more and more about the bee dance. I mean, I guess I probably knew about it before I worked on insects, but obviously got to know more and more about it. And people often talk about it as though they often call it a language or a symbolic communication and so forth. So it's often brought up when people are saying, well, are insects really intelligent? You know, do they have cognitive capabilities and so on? And the bee dance is a popular example of, well, here they're doing some kind of symbolic communication, so they must be capable of some kind of intelligence more than just simple reactions or memory or whatever.
And how did the honeybee waggle dance get on your radar?
I mean, my background is neuroscience and computing, so I also have a bit of background in computer science and kind of networks. But I think I've just always been fascinated by honeybees and how they kind of operate individually, but more on kind of like a colony level as well. And I find that the waggle dance is one of the only examples of this kind of communication of location sharing within invertebrates that we know of. And I think that was one of the points that really drew me to it and being interested. Von Frisch got the Nobel Prize for it, over 50 years ago. I think we were interested especially in how nestmates assimilate the information. A lot of work has been done on the dancers and how they're communicating the information. Communication is a two-way thing, obviously, and how the nestmates are properly assimilating and obtaining this information in a form that they can then fly to the resource is something that is being much more ambiguous, because obviously we can see the dance on the comb, we can see the nestmates interact, but for a long time it's been quite unclear how the nestmate part of the communication.
Well, I was wondering if they're communicating vector and distance, they're not necessarily telling you what the food is, or is that maybe communicated through that sharing process?
I think that there's several cues available in the behavior. From our research, we've been focusing on how nestmates assimilate this vector information, distance and direction. But, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they also obviously share like the odors from the flower, a bit of the food as well. So there is a lot of information that they will be also sharing as opposed to just the vector information. Yeah.
And if two bees come back with new food locations at the same time, do they have a dance-off, or how does that work?
The more interesting case in a kind of dance-off might be in swarming behavior. So this is where bees will dance for particular locations that they think the colony should swarm to. And obviously, you can't have half the colony, all going to different places. They do need to come to a decision at the end of the day so that half of them all go to the same place. So in that circumstance, they kind of do all kind of come to the idea that there's one location that they should go to. But in terms of food, I think it's a bit more flexible.
So between the discovery of the waggle dance, which I guess has been several decades, and your recent insights about the communication with antennae, are there any other major milestones in between? Perhaps hypotheses or new discoveries that are part of the story?
For understanding the navigation process, there's been a lot of things. So how the dancer bee comes to have a vector in its head that it's expressing through the dance. There's been a lot of breakthroughs in what they're sensing in the world that allows them to be able to do that navigation. So they get compass information from skylight, a lot of work on how they measure speed and so on. So there's been a lot of different factors. And then more recently on what brain circuits might underlie that. All of those things come into play. I don't know if you want to say, Anna, anything else you think really about the waggle dance particularly that...
Yeah, about the waggle dance particularly. I mean, I feel like there has been a lot of different research published on it, over the past 20 years and longer. And it's difficult to say which ones I feel like are breakthroughs or not. I feel like some of the recent one from last year would be the observation of how important it is for bees to observe other bees dancing in order to learn how to dance. I mean, that was quite an interesting finding in how bees actually start this communication and whether it's purely innate, like they obviously get this urge to start foraging and dancing, but actually that, they're most accurate when they have other bees to observe dancing, which I thought was a very interesting finding.
So people had watched the bee dance and seen that it related to where the bee had found the food. But proving that the follower bee was actually using that information to find the food again, that took quite a long time because, yes, you might find that bees are turning up where that food is, but there was at least one person who, said, well, at least one group who were basically arguing, well, actually the bees are just finding it by odor. And it's kind of almost coincidental that the dance is exciting them, is getting them ready to go out, but they're not actually getting the direct information. So this basically got demonstrated when people started doing radar tracking of bees. So they actually attached tiny little radar antennae to the bees and tracked them. And then they showed that indeed the bees that had followed the dance were really going directly to where the dancer bee had indicated. And even doing that, if you kind of shifted them, so you took them from the nest and moved them, they would fly on exactly the right vector, even though the surroundings might be different. There's no food there, nothing else to help them. They would still fly that vector and then search in the right location. That was kind of in the mid-90s, I guess, that was demonstrated.
Well, we were discussing a little earlier about this idea of the follow-on bee, that bee would go behind the dancer and learn the information that way and then fly off. And that seems utterly plausible, right? Why couldn't that be? I'm sure there are bees that do go behind the dancer, and so they're in the right position to be consistent with that hypothesis. At what point do you start to doubt that hypothesis?
Some groups have filmed the dances and the various positions occupied by nestmates throughout following these dances, and seen that a nestmate that follows, even towards the head of the dancer as opposed to the back one, will still potentially be found at the food source. So it was this evidence that not only the bees that are behind are successful, which means, maybe they could be assimilating the information just by being directly behind. But the fact that we saw bees who were occupying other positions were also finding the food suggests that there was another mechanism and a way that they were accounting for their angle to the dancer.
So I'm trying to picture that comb a little better. You're saying it's dark. The sun's a sphere, as far as I know. Is the comb a sphere and they're climbing on it, or is it flat? What does that look like?
There are thousands of bees all moving around different areas of the comb. What we do is we have an observation hive. So this is a special type of hive that has a glass panel so we can see into it. And what we do is we film under red light. It's thought that bees are not sensitive to red light. So we still want to maintain the darkness and natural conditions that they experience when their nest is fully kind of covered. And we essentially film at a really high frame rate, so 200 frames per second in a high resolution as well. So you've got to remember that a honeybee is really small. People think of bumblebees as being quite big, but honeybees are really small. So you really have to kind of be close to be able to watch what their antennae are doing. And their antennae are tiny and they're moving rapidly as well, depending on what they're doing. The footage that we obtain does look very kind of busy and full with a lot of different stuff going on. And we just try to zoom in on the dancer and the follower bee interactions.
So could we talk about data collection a little bit? I'm picturing, again, a difficult, chaotic scene, maybe even hard to see depending on the resolution of the camera and the light and all that. How do you go from that video signal to the vectors on even the small antennae on individual bees?
Yeah, so the data collection was certainly a painful process. There are some contexts in animal behavior where the animal is quite easy to track. In the case of tracking the antennae of the bees following dances, it is a very difficult task. And at the time of us collecting the data, I did look at various automated machine learning methods for doing so, even popular ones like deep lab cut, which is common amongst kind of animal pose estimation research. But I found essentially the footage contains a lot of dark areas, the image is changing. There are a few frames where the antennae go out of shot because, for example, it's being bashed by the dancer. And again, bees are so small and the antennae is so tiny that I just was never able to find a kind of consistent and robust automated way of doing it. So we predominantly went through a kind of manual process of going through the frames and essentially annotating the positions of the antennae throughout the video. Obviously, at 200 frames per second, this took some time.
Sure. Could you expand on that? It sounds a bit monumentous. Was it yourself or a whole team, or how did all this get done?
Yeah, so this was myself. It did take time. I think it was, I don't know how long, but it was just through a period of, doing some consistently. And at this time, we really, beforehand, I had no kind of preconception of what we might find. So I was just kind of doing it hopefully that there would be something interesting in it. So it was really nice that there was. But it was a difficult and lonely challenge.
So you have some notion that probably the antennae are involved. What's the process like then through data analysis? How does the data then inform your finding?
Yeah, so we started off by plotting various different aspects of the data. Initially looking at kind of individual bees and what the movement, over time, what was their movement at the antennae. We also looked at other features such as the angle between the antennae. And obviously, in the end, we were looking at, the angle of the left antennae and the right antennae. And I think really the picture came together, when we grouped the data according to where each nestmate was relative to the dancer. That's when we compared the left and right antennae that we saw that there really is this kind of transition from being deflected maximally when at one side to smoothly rotating to being maximally deflected on the other side. So it was this mirror image of where the antennae were rotating. Obviously, there was noise to it, but when you kind of binned the data according to the angle, I think we used various bin sizes, but at 5-degree angles to the dancer that you could see this pattern kind of taking place, although that there's noise. And we also looked at using various models to try work out just from that raw input, could a model decode from a left and right position? Can the model predict where the nestmate is as well?
And can we explore that model? Is that a machine learning system or something statistical? What is the model?
Yeah, so, this was a slightly smaller part of the project and more of just, can a model make use of this? We looked at the multiple regression Gaussian process model to doing this, where we looked at pairs of left and right antennae angles and looked at whether there was this relationship. And we found that there was, although it was quite noisy, but we got some evidence that kind of a model, not knowing anything about the system, could take the left and right pairs of the angles and predict the angle to the dancer from it.
Yeah, but that definitely wasn't the end of the the story.
Yeah.
Once we realized that meant that the follower could know what angle it was to the dancer, but then we were aware that the follower kept changing its angle to the dancer all the time, all the way through the waggle. For a while, we didn't know how. It basically looked impossible. How could it possibly be getting some kind of consistent readout of the dancer's direction from the fact that it was moving all around? And even if it did know what its angle was, how was it doing this? So that was kind of the second key breakthrough, really, was when we realized this analogy in the neural circuit of how this could be done. So it was and that maybe we can try and explain that, but yes, it might be helpful to do that through a few questions.
And I think we have a risk of maybe anthropomorphizing here, but I'm curious if you have an understanding from the bee's perspective. Is that anti-correlation, the orthogonal direction of the antennae, a sensing mechanism, or is that an expression of the information?
At the moment, we're assuming that the antennae get in that position because the dancer is going past. But it is possible that they're sensing the dancer in some other way and then putting their antennae in that position. And one intriguing possibility there, which could still be both of those, is that it's been shown that dancing bees create an electric field around them, and that insect antennae actually do respond to electric fields. That might be part of the explanation of why the antennae are in that position, not just that they're being bumped by the waggle.
And can we go back to the moment where you've got the raw data and you're starting to do analysis? Is there a eureka moment somewhere in there?
Well, I mean, I guess because there were two parts to the research. The first was like looking at what the antennae were doing. And then there was that like one version of the plot where I'd plotted it on a different scale and I didn't really see the relationship. But then it was when I changed the scale and then I saw this relationship, I was like, oh, wow, like that is really interesting. So that was like one moment. And then I guess the second half of our research was like, when we essentially fed the raw input and these antennae angles into a model of the bee brain and was looking at what it was predicting in terms of where the nestmates would fly. And we saw that it was a reasonable prediction that would be centered on the feeder and kind of fanned out. And so that was also a feasible outcome that we saw that we were excited to see.
I think for me, I definitely had an aha moment in one of our supervision meetings when basically, when Anna had identified this relationship of the antennae to the thing. And I was trying to think, how could this actually work? And I realized there was a direct analogy to something that we'd worked on before, which was how a bee that's maybe flying at all different angles. So it's not flying forward, but it's slipping sideways, or it's flying backwards, or it's, doing all sorts of facing different ways, is still able to keep track of where it's moving over the ground enough to be able to find its way home again. Our understanding of how that worked, which is based on optical flow and having optical flow come from 45 degrees in one direction and 45 degrees in the other direction, was an important breakthrough in an earlier model we'd built about 8 years ago. And where I suddenly realized that it was an exact analogy, exactly the same problem as what we needed to solve here. And therefore, this circuit should be able to do it. So that I think even before, you put the data in and we saw the results come out, I was convinced that the circuit in principle should be able to do this transformation that we needed to be able to actually get the dance vector from the antennal information.
Having looked at a lot of the video and labeled it, I've been back to this a couple times saying I just see chaos when I see video of a honeybee comb. If I slowed down that 200 frames per second, or maybe if you did, do you now have you developed the eyes to watch them and see this happening, or do you only see it in the data?
No, I think I've labeled so many frames now of bees doing this that I definitely think I have an eye for it. And sometimes if I'm watching the video and showing it to someone, I can think that it's really obvious what's going on because I can immediately see. And then the person's like, I don't know what I'm looking at. Like, I don't even know which ones are the followers. So, I think I definitely have become accustomed to it. But yeah, it obviously helps slowing down the footage. You can see the individual bees at different positions with these kind of signature antennae positions.
I guess maybe the straw man argument against that would be to say it's like a wind-up toy, like some creature out of Doctor Who. It's all gears and you just twist a knob and it goes off and behaves like a bee, and it's purely mechanical. Is that a fair criticism? Can we negate that hypothesis?
Well, as someone who builds robots, I don't think calling something purely mechanical is a strong limit on what it's capable of doing. I mean, once you include some computation in the mechanics, then it's hard to say where the dividing line is.
I guess maybe I'll make an analogy to like the skeletal system or the muscle system. You can get one of those models and see how it all fits together. And if you get a model of the brain and see how all the neurons plug into each other, you haven't necessarily learned much about the brain and its mechanism and how it works. Are you able to inspect something? Like I think of the human brain as a bit of a black box. Is the bee brain more accessible?
Yes, in a word. And that's one reason we look at insects. So, for example, from an anatomical perspective, people have done a huge amount of tracing of single cells. And one thing that's very striking about insect brains is you literally have what people call identified neurons, as in if you find a particular type of neuron with particular connections in one bee brain, you'll find the same neuron with the same connections in another bee brain. Not everything is exactly one-to-one. There's some variance, but more or less you can find these circuits over and over. And even find, even in different insects, you can find very closely corresponding neurons, so neurons that seem to fall into the same connection patterns with a few significant differences, but also a lot of commonality. So it means we can literally, when we build these models, we're building them at the level of single neurons. We treat each neuron as one computing node in a very standard way that is very similar to how artificial neural networks. So it basically adds up all its inputs and has an output that's potentially a nonlinear response to the sum of the inputs. So in that sense, we're still working at quite an abstract level compared to what real neurons are like. So we're not including the action potentials or the details of the anatomy and the axons. We just kind of keep the connectivity from as close as we can to what we know from the brain, but then we abstract.
Well, you've mentioned a few times this term neural circuit. Mm-hmm. Coming from my background in AI, I have a very specific linear algebra kind of vision of what that is. What is a neural circuit to you?
Okay, it's a set of brain cells that are wired up in the brain of an animal. That's what we're talking about. And models of those circuits, yeah.
And does that have a direct mapping to the bee brain? Like, I'm familiar with C. elegans, and we interviewed someone from this project called Open Worm.
Yes, sure. Mm-hmm.
I don't know the number, but it's a precise number of neurons, like 300.
302, I think.
Thank you, yeah. And they know all of them and their purpose, and it's all mapped out, kind of unlike our brain, where we know a lot about the connections, but I don't think it's fully mapped out yet. The bee's somewhere in between, right? Do we have it basically fully mapped out, or what's the state of the science?
Yeah, so roughly speaking, so the fly is almost fully mapped out. And so that's where people have kind of been focusing their efforts is to map that. This particular area, the circuit for navigation exists. That's being fully mapped out in the fly. And then in the bee, it's being mapped out to a certain extent, but not fully.
And then when you think about the neural circuit, we have good reason to trust it. What might we infer from that? What other computations are bees capable of?
They're capable of doing this conversion from whichever way they're facing when they're flying. They're using a sun compass and they're using optic flow to calculate where they're going and to do what's called path integration, which is a constant integration of your velocity to keep an estimate of where you are relative to the home location. So they can do that. Different people are looking at different things this system can do in terms of kind of once you realize it can do vector algebra, basically, then there's all sorts of things it potentially can do. So, for example, selecting between different goals and driving the movement towards those different goals, or weighting different goals, or learning the relationship between two different sensory cues. So there's some insects that can learn that, they're using a sun compass and then the wind is coming from a consistent direction. And then if they go undercover, they can still use the wind direction as the compass because they've learned the relationship between the two and they can update that very quickly. So there's a lot of things this circuit seems to be good for. And that's one reason it seems to still be there in pretty much every insect. In fact, every arthropod, I think, has the equivalent of this circuit.
And I'm curious about maybe why the results came about now. And to some degree, it's that you had the time to ask and you did the work to make the inquiry. Perhaps there's a version where HD cameras are available and affordable, or maybe just the science needed to evolve to, because as they say, we're built on the shoulders of giants. Why did you get this result now?
People suspected the antennae were involved, and it was kind of like, yeah, we know how the nestmates decode the information. They use their antennae. But I think beyond looking for a neural circuit, people didn't really venture far into that. The research of the insect central complex, which is like the brain area that we've been discussing, as that's been evolving, there's been all of these new insights as to how other insects are doing these sophisticated calculations. Part of the model was based on insights from this research that is kind of an emerging field in the past decade or so. That could be a reason potentially why it was now and maybe not 20 years ago.
The observation that there's this relationship between the antennae angle and where the dancer is, people could have seen that earlier, particularly, as you say, if they'd happened to have high, and people did have high resolution cameras, high frame rate cameras, but I think the problem is up till now they've needed very large amounts of light. So you have to have very bright lights for a high frame rate camera, and that basically means you can't use it in a bee nest. So there are technical reasons like that, but hypothetically, people could have seen this a long time ago.
And I think even there were a few attempts. I mean, I can think of 2 attempts in the past. I already mentioned there was one paper that was looking at the angle between the antennae. And then there was actually an earlier paper as well that was just looking at the pattern of the contacts of the antennae with the dancer's body. Both these studies were looking at kind of lower frame rates and were only looking at the contact at one point throughout the movement of the abdomen. Whereas our analysis was looking at the position of the antennae throughout kind of every point of the abdomen. So it's looking at slightly different time resolutions as well.
Are there other communication behaviors that you'd like to start looking into? Maybe future insights you could gather?
It's very interesting whether ants actually tell each other where the food is. So far, no one's really been able to demonstrate that they do that, other than following each other. So they can follow one another to the food. They can leave chemical trails to find the food, but what they don't appear to do is inside the nest communicate the information in the way that the bees do. I started out looking at how crickets find each other, basically. So how a male cricket calling and how that's communicating to female crickets who will find their way there. There's a lot of interesting communication systems. But I think it's this particular link to navigation that we found really important. And also that it's this popular example of language. People call it the language of the bees. And in a sense, I guess we've slightly demystified that, in that what we're arguing is it's not a language. It's pretty much a hardwired system with some learning, as Anna mentioned, that has been shown recently, that allows them to actually do this communication.
Are there crossover insights then that you can take into robotics? Should we build robots that communicate with their antennae?
So we have this as a student project at the moment. So we have previously put the path integration onto a robot. So the same network that we've been talking about, the same neural circuit, we have put that on a flying robot and shown that it can indeed fly out on a more random path and then come straight back to where it started. But we now have a student project which is trying to do this just with small wheeled robots in the lab, but have one of them come and do a bee dance and the other one use kind of the equivalent of antennae to detect what the dance is. A bee's antennae are actually pretty amazing as sensory systems. And so we don't really have anything that's equivalent in robotics. And so we have to sort of decide in what way should we simplify it? Will we still get the information that we want? And that's generally a problem for most of the robot models we build, that the sensory systems and the mechanical systems are just not as good as the real animal.
I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on the state of the field. Is this the very earliest days, or are there major contributions at industrial scales and things like that?
It's been around a long time, the field. The contributions are growing. So there's been recently a couple of spin-out companies who are really trying to take things that we know from insects in terms of visual processing, for example, and apply those. It's coming. And I think the big advantage potentially is that insects have small brains, so therefore they have to do things efficiently. It's not that it's going to solve the whole of robotics, but there are a lot of aspects of robotics where insects are very good at doing something with very low power, very clever sensing, and we might be able to use that in those cases. So I think that's increasing. It's fairly obviously the case that there are things that animals can do that robots can't. Another current project in my lab is actually just looking at how ants pick up objects, which you'd think should be With all the wonderful AI we have at the moment, robots should be able to pick up random objects in clutter, and they're really bad at it. And ants are very good at it. So we really think there's quite a lot we can still learn by looking at how biological systems function and using them in robotics. And then going the other way, what we've found is that it really helps. If you have a hypothesis about how a biological system works, trying to implement it in a robot really shows up very, very quickly where you're glossing over bits of your hypothesis. So you're just making assumptions about the sensory system or assumptions about the motor system or assuming something can happen in between. You have a nice little black box in your model that solves the problem. You have to cache all of those out. If you build the robot, every single piece of it has to be cached out. And maybe not everything will turn out to work exactly the same way as it does in biology, but you have to have at least some concrete implementation for every part of it. And that's proved to be really informative.
Anna, what's next for you?
So I'm currently in the later stages of my PhD looking to submit midsummer. I'm currently in the phase of writing up and can't quite see past the deadline yet. So still thinking about it, yeah.
Fair enough. Barbara, similar question. What are you most excited about in the lab right now?
I'm really interested in lots of different things that insects can do, and maybe at the moment looking a little more closely at what is it that insects can do that robots can't, so that we can have the most impact from understanding the insect. But I'm also very excited by just how quickly we're getting insight into a lot of detail in the insect brain. So we have looked at other areas of the insect brain as well, and now we're starting to be able to build models that actually, combine these different areas. And so that's also maybe within my lifetime we'll have a complete insect brain model.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to chat with me about the work.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting us. We've enjoyed it.